Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first edition of a series of interviews that we're calling In Conversation With, where we talk to a variety of people from the world of politics, but also culture. We've got some academics that we're going to be interviewing over the course of the next few weeks. So really a variety of people who have connections with the City of Leeds, who hopefully will give us some insight into how they see the city coming out of the COVID pandemic. Now, as the director of Leeds Civic Trust, and these events are being organised by Leeds Civic Trust, we obviously have a particular interest in the built environment, in the heritage of the city, and in the amenities that we have in the city. So the slant will be very much on those sorts of issues as we rebuild in the next months and years to come. I'd like to introduce our first guest, really, and our first guest is Hilary Benn MP. Now, Hilary, of course, is an MP of fairly long standing. I think 1999 was the year in which you were elected in a by-election following the death of Derek Fatchett, and since then, Hilary's been a cabinet minister, a couple of roles in the cabinet. He's been on the opposition front benches, and more recently, he's undertaken work chairing select committees. And I should say, at all times, Hilary's been a great friend of the Civic Trust and supported us very much in the work that we do across the city, as a representative of the city centre, of course, but also of other wards on the southern edge of the city. So welcome, Hilary. Very nice to see you.
And nice to see you, Martin.
So I thought we would kick off just by asking you to say a little bit about what you're currently doing in Parliament, what your current role is. I know you did you were chairing the Brexit Select Committee, but that's now obviously happened, and so there's a new phase. So tell us what your sort of role is in Westminster at the moment, and really what you've been doing over the last year since everything changed last March. How have you been able to fulfill your role as an MP?
Well, it's been incredibly different because Parliament during the lockdown has been a ghost town, and you'll have seen the pictures of the chamber. You only go into the chamber if you've got a question to ask or a contribution to make, and then you leave again. So in recent months, more and more MPs have been contributing virtually. It's a bit strange to make a speech in the House of Commons sitting where I am at the moment. It's very hard to wave your arms about, which I like to do when I'm speaking. But I think the biggest single change has been the enormous increase which all MPs have experienced in workload because of the effects of the pandemic. Because so many people have been in touch at the beginning, loved ones who were stuck in the wrong part of the world and couldn't get back, people who are afraid of losing their job, people who think their workplace is not COVID secure, people whose businesses are going bust, lobbying for financial help to keep themselves going, the impact it's had on the city centre economy. I was on a Zoom call first thing this morning for the nighttime economy, a lot of nightclubs and bars and restaurants that are wondering how they're going to cope because they owe a lot of rent to a lot of people, and how are the landlords going to react. So it's been very practical, but it reflects an important but largely unseen part of the job of a member of Parliament, which is helping people, because I regard that as a really important part of what I do as the Member of Parliament for Leeds Central. People come to seek my assistance. I never promise to solve a problem because you can't, but I promise to try. And I think that's really important in life. You do your best and you are a voice. The point about being elected is you're given a voice. I happen to have a very loud one, but those initials MP mean when you raise something, whether it's in the House of Commons with a minister, with a government department, with the council, hospital trust, home office, you're going to get an answer, and that's how you assist people. So it has been a very strange time, because Parliament, as well as what you see on the chamber, is a ferment of discussion, debate, meetings, all party groups and so on. And none of that has been happening of late because of the lockdown and the need to practice social distancing.
And so, in terms of the role that you've taken on the national stage, tell us a little bit about that, the select committee work.
Well, that was in the wake of the referendum result. A select committee was established to shadow what was then the Brexit department. So what we were doing was scrutinising the negotiations, the agreements that were reached, and to make recommendations. It was an unusual select committee because in the main, as you'll know, Martin, select committees try and work on the basis of consensus. I'm afraid that proved very difficult, not to say impossible, because people came to the committee with very firm views on Brexit on either side of the debate. And so in reaching agreement on reports, we often had to do that by voting, which is ultimately the way in which you resolve different views. The committee ceased to exist at the beginning of January, but I've, along with some MPs and business leaders, academics and others, we've set up something called the UK Trade and Business Commission, which is continuing to take evidence to try and understand what the impact of our changed relationship is with the European Union, because Brexit is done, it's over, the transition period came to an end, we've left, and the question now is not anymore were you for or against, because that's history. The question now is, what is the new relationship going to look like? And what we're trying to focus on is where there are difficulties, and we've seen those well publicised, from Scottish fishermen having trouble selling their catch in Europe, the increased paperwork and cost, the problems moving goods across to Northern Ireland, the arts sector, performers for whom touring in Europe will be much more difficult, and lots of others. What we intend to do is to come forward with practical recommendations to try and make things easier for businesses and people. But for that to take place, there will have to be a change, in my view, in attitude, both on the part of the UK government and the European Union, because at the moment they're a bit stuck, and there is some tension, to be frank, in the relationship. But I hope that will ease over time, and we will say to each other, look, we're still neighbours, we're still very big and important trading partners, and we cooperate on lots of things. So let's find a sensible way forward. And in the course of that, develop a new relationship which reflects the referendum result, albeit it was close, but does right by people, not just in the UK, but also in the rest of the European Union, because they too are facing a new setup. And we want to encourage business because that's really important for jobs and the incomes and the family life of my constituents.
Yeah, you mentioned your constituents there right at the end, and I guess a question following on from that, this double whammy, if you like, of Brexit, and whether people view it as positive or negative, it is a shock to the system to an extent, and obviously the impact of COVID and the impact that that's had on the economy. Some figures coming out today show a recovery, but a recovery from obviously a low base. I mean, it's you would hope for recovery when the economy has taken such a hit, but it's a case of, do we get back to where we were before COVID happened, and how quickly that happens. Reflecting on Leeds, Hilary, and the local economy in Leeds, what are your sort of general thoughts about how Leeds can recover from the current situation? Are there things about Leeds in particular that you think are an advantage that we can sort of push? Are there things maybe that hold us back? How would you sort of see Leeds developing over the next few years?
Well, there are clearly going to be difficulties for the businesses that have been most adversely affected by the COVID pandemic. And I gave an example a moment ago. But look, Leeds has a great strength, which is the diversity of its economy. When you compare us with some other cities and towns in the north, which were historically much more dependent on one industrial sector, that is not the case in Leeds. And when you look at the economy, we've got the hospital, the health sector, we've got financial services, we've got the law, manufacturing, some very advanced manufacturing, retail, thriving small businesses, creative industries, the arts, music, to name just a few, and digital. And so we've got to play to our strengths. And I think part of the reason for Leeds's relative economic success has been the openness of the city and the city council to those who want to come and invest in the city of the future. Look at the arrival of Channel 4 recently in the occupying the wonderful refurbished Majestic. But I would say to you, Martin, that the single biggest priority for me as the Member of Parliament for Leeds Central is we have to ensure that all of our citizens are able to take part in that economic success. Now, I mentioned the digital sector. When I met them before the pandemic, it's really big in Leeds. It's lots of small and medium sized, but highly innovative companies that are looking for people who can come and work with them, who've got programming skills. And some people have done computer science at university. There are courses that are run by companies that are intensive, 3 months, and they have a fantastic success in getting people into permanent employment, but they cost, you know, £9,000-12,000. Now, lots of my constituents don't have £9,000 or £12,000 hanging about. So if we're going to ensure that everyone can take part, we have to find a way of supporting those of my constituents to see that they have a future in the Leeds economy, because it is striking about the city. Lots of people commute in from further away to do jobs in the city centre, and yet we've got communities 1, 2, 3 miles away where there's a higher level of unemployment, and that is fundamentally about skills and opportunity. And the aspiration that comes with having skills and opportunity. And that begins in education, but it's also about thinking at every stage about how, when the new jobs come, they can be made available to local people. And there's some very good examples of that. When Asda was opening the new supermarket in Middleton, there was a lot of effort to enable people locally to get the jobs with a considerable degree of success. And I think that that is important, because then people have a stake in the success of those businesses, and it's good for families, it's good for people's lives and their children if they have them. So I think it's a combination of those two things, but it is going to be challenging. And the city centre itself, because of the changing nature of retail, which is a much bigger change, and the impact of COVID, and we're talking on Zoom. My first meeting this morning was with the council, and we were discussing, well, what percentage of people who've been working from home will in the end come back to work 5 days a week? Now, actually, when I talk to people, they will often say, well, I'd like to do a couple of days at home and come into the office for 3 days. Well, that too is going to have an impact on the city centre, the need for office space and so on. So we've got to anticipate that and then find other ways of keeping the city centre thriving and exciting and attractive, because it's, you know, one of the greatest assets we've got as a city.
What do you think the city centre could look like in, let's say, 5 years' time? I mean, the big department stores are you know, the Debenhams has closed down. I think, you know, some of the other large chains have moved out. You know, the main shopping streets in the city centre will change, just because shops have moved out. At the same time, as you quite rightly say, changing work habits may well endure. I mean, you know, people will return, no doubt, and are returning to the city centre offices, but maybe not on a full-time basis, or maybe not 9 to 5. You know, maybe a different working pattern. So, you know, what replaces that? What keeps the city centre as a vibrant place, given that, you know, it provides jobs for lots of people, including people in your constituency, and people you know, people in less prosperous parts of your constituency, shall we say?
Well, I suppose the first thing to think of is, what is it that you have to really want to do in person, as opposed to pressing a button on your phone or your laptop? And you can see that reflected in the kind of businesses, you know, compared with 20, 30 years ago. There are a lot of people who are working in the city centre on a working day sitting in a coffee shop, because the coffee shop works on the basis we provide free broadband. You know, by at least a coffee an hour, whatever it is. And these may be very small businesses, single person operations, people starting out creatively. They then may want a space to, if they're selling a product. So if you think of those department stores, in a way, it's going back to the original concept is you have different departments selling different kind of products. So maybe someone says, well, I just want a bit of space. Now, if you go into many department stores now, you will see different brands around, because that's the way that they have developed. So we may see that. We may see even more residential in the city centre. I hope we're going to see a lot more trees and green space, because it's one of the things that the heart of the city lacks. We're going to need that for climate change, because we know that more tree cover in city centres helps to lower the temperature in the hotter weather that we know is heading our way because of the climate change we've already put in train. And then all of the other activities, as people do return to the cinema and the theatre and Opera North, and all of the great things that are offered in the city centre. And then you've got spaces like Millennium Square, which I think have proved to be a fantastic success. And I remember when the vision of Millennium Square, because it used to be car parking and municipal flower beds, as I recall it. And people said, well, why are we spending all this money on this? What a waste of time and so on. And who would get rid of it now? Nobody would. And there's a little bit of a history lesson there, because I always used to say about Millennium Square, well, don't forget that the town hall was over budget and much criticised, but would anyone suggest that we get rid of it now? No, they wouldn't. So the final recognition comes to people sometimes a bit late. And I think that's another example with all of the activities that have been taking place, from Light Night to the Christmas market and the skating, the rallies showing the football or the rugby at times of great sporting occasion. We've got to be innovative and supportive to keep the city centre going, and we need a better transport system, but we might come on to that.
We may well come on to that. Hilary, just sort of leading on from that then, I mean, you could characterise your constituency as a constituency of two halves.
Yep.
You could say the city centre, prosperous, able to adapt, which is what you're really explaining just then. And then other parts of your constituency, which are more deprived, and which where there is a barrier, both, I guess, psychological, but also physical, between the city centre and some of the other wards. I'm thinking Beeson, I'm thinking Middleton, the M62, the railway. These physical barriers that almost act as a physical as well as psychological between the city centre and the rest of the south of Leeds. And with the council are encouraging growth in the South Bank, the Holbeck area. How can that be something that actually benefits people who live further away? You don't want to create something that is an island of prosperity almost that people elsewhere don't benefit from. How do you think the South Bank in particular, and and actually my observation is that over the last 12 months, certainly the construction and development in general has continued. It's not really slowed down.
Yeah.
There was an initial period of slowing down, but certainly we're seeing a lot of planning applications now, not least in the South Bank. How do you make sure that it's not something that is an island that doesn't benefit other people?
Well, the South Bank is a huge opportunity, I think, for the city. I would make a plea about housing, because when I reflect on my casework as a member of Parliament, more and more people contacting me to say, I'm living in overcrowded accommodation, I can't afford the private rented sector, I bid for properties, I'm number 400 on the list. We have an acute housing crisis. And the story of the city, one thing that we haven't got right in the last 20 years is, most of the properties that have been built in the city centre have been 1 or 2 bedroom flats. Where is the real need? It's for 3 and 4 bedroom houses. And we haven't got that right. I think that's the first point. The second is that development brings other opportunities with it, because people see that there's activity going on. And I would come back to my point about jobs, Martin, because jobs will be created by that development. And what we have to relentlessly focus on is making sure that people can take advantage of those opportunities. The physical barriers, I mean, I take your point. It'd be hard to think of a city centre that was more crisscrossed by large roads. And we long ago came to the limit of road building in the city centre, and we do need better connectivity, which is why top of my list is for a rapid transit system. But it's also about enabling young people in particular to have the skills to see their future there. And you look at some of the other developments around there with the UTC and the Leeds College of Building, what Leeds City College has been doing, the Ruth Gorse Academy, just thinking of that narrow area to the side of the South Bank development. So I do think we have a great opportunity, and together with what still called by some the Holbeck Urban Village, and you can see the development that is taking place there, it showed our capacity to reinvent ourselves. And I think that that's really important, because if you take something like Marshall Mill, when it was a mill processing flax, it employed about 700 people. Yeah. And the last time I visited some years ago, there's about 700 people in that building, but they're working in digital and media and so on. And that's a really good example of how the physical building has been renewed, and it's providing different types of jobs. And that's what helps to keep Leeds overall successful, even though the gap between opportunity and lack of opportunity, wealth and poverty is enormous in the city. And when I think of the number of my constituents who have to go up to strangers to ask for food because they can't feed their families, I'm afraid it tells you something about our society, not just in the city. We're the 6th richest country in the world, and 1 million people are doing that in the last year, and we cannot allow that to continue.
Of course, the other good thing about the current use of Marshall's Mill is it doesn't employ children, as far as I'm aware.
Well,
so
that's progress.
700 jobs. So there is, so there is
real progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Hilary, could I just sort of broaden things a little bit and talk about what's referred to as the levelling up agenda? This idea, and it's a term that's actually used, I think, across the political divide these days. The idea that investment should switch, or at least, well, levelling up suggests you keep the same investment in the southeast, but you actually increase it elsewhere. Where do you think where would you sort of say in Leeds hard cash needs to go if someone had a very large check that they could present to you and you could decide, you know, where it should be spent? What would your sort of priority be, do you think?
Well, the two would be housing and transport, and skills. Actually, the 3 priorities would be those 3. Why transport? We are the largest city in Europe without a rapid transit system, and we need one. Now, there was the whole Supertram business, which in the end got knocked on the head, and then the NGT trolleybus scheme, which was a second best, I'll be the first to admit that, was killed off by a planning inspector in Bristol. Now, I've been a really strong supporter, because of my experience, of devolution. I have seen schemes that have had to make the journey down to the Department of Transport in London, where a civil servant decides what our priorities should be. No, that is wrong. The government should make funding available and then say, well, it's up to you to determine your priorities. It's like the change we've seen in my lifetime over the way in which school budgets are run. In the old days, the council specified just about everything to do with the running of the school, and then it turned into local management of schools, and schools heads and governors determine how the money is going to be spent. So transport is the first thing, and I would look at it more broadly than just Leeds, because I think it's a West Yorkshire challenge. We need a modern, effective, integrated transport system with a single payment system. So you can decide, I'll get on a bus, or I'll get on a tram, or I'll get on a train, and I can wave my card, and that's the way it's going to work. And when it comes to the buses, because many of my constituents, that's how they get about, that's how they go to work, we should have control of the buses. It's terribly simple. You know, London has, and I've long argued, people use the jargon bus regulation. It basically means being able to run the buses. And if it's good enough for London, it's good enough for Leeds and for Manchester. And when the trolleybus scheme was being put forward, you had First Bus arguing against the trolleybus. Now, this is a wholly dysfunctional system. It's ridiculous that that should be the case. We, as the citizens and our elected representatives, which includes Tracy Brabin, who's just made history as the first elected mayor of West Yorkshire, and I know this is a high priority for her, we should have control of that, because we're going to need it for effective transport links. We're also going to need it to help us with carbon reduction, because the other huge challenge we've got, which is also going to provide opportunities, Martin, is we've got to get to net zero. And that means petrol and diesel cars after a certain date, they won't be sold, but they're not going to be able to run on our roads. We aren't going to be able to rely on gas to heat our homes or our offices. So how are we going to pay for that? Because I've got many constituents who can't afford the gas bill, let alone a new boiler or heating system. Who is going to oversee the process of transition? Where is the new equipment, the cars and the heat pumps or the hydrogen boilers going to be made? What an opportunity to create jobs and new industries. So I think we have to see the future and the change that is coming because of the need to move to a net zero economy as an enormous opportunity if we get our policy and our approach and our regulation and our incentives right.
Do you think, the Leeds City Council recently concluded a consultation on a new transport strategy, and the Combined Authority have done the same, actually. They've been consulting as well. And, you know, we can have a wish list as long as your arm about transport interventions that would transform the city. But as you rightly say, they have to be paid for. You know, one option, the only option at the moment, is either paying for it through the existing taxation system, that money raised locally, which doesn't really get you very far, or going cap in hand to the government, which again is dependent on the government having the money or wanting to give the money out to particular projects. Do you think we need to think about revenue raising at a West Yorkshire level and actually taking some hard decisions on things like congestion charging, on workplace parking levies, you know, air quality zones, these sorts of things that actually raise money locally that can be spent locally? Would you advocate that sort of action?
Well, there is a third option that could contribute to the two sources of finance that you've mentioned, and that is private investment, because there are businesses, organizations who might be prepared to say, well, we're prepared to help put money up front if we can share some of the revenue. But it comes back to decision making, because who's going to do that, spend 2 or 3 years planning a scheme only to find that it's killed off by the planning inspector? Well, I wouldn't put the money.
Yeah,
certainty. You've absolutely put your finger on it. And that is the argument for us being in charge of our own destiny, including the ability to say, if we want this to happen, then it is going to happen. And that needs change in that sense in the planning system. Now, in the Queen's speech that was announced yesterday, there are changes to the planning laws, which are yet another attempt to try and address the problem of house building by taking what, in my view, is the wrong approach. Because I think if you give communities the power to determine where new housing is built, what kind of housing is built, who gets the housing, then I think you will find communities much more willing to realize, well, we better build some homes for our kids and our grandkids, rather than the current system where you can designate an area and then a developer comes along and says, well, that doesn't really work for me, but I like that green field over there, so I'm going to put in a planning application, and if you turn me down, I'm off to the planning inspector who will tell me that I can go ahead. Now that, it too is a dysfunction. I don't have it in for planning inspectors. They're wonderful people and they do very important job of work, as you will know, Martin, in making sure that we get the right development in the right place. But I'm making a point about giving us responsibility. And then in those circumstances, you realize you can't have everything immediately. and you prioritize. Nye Bevan famously said, socialism is the language of priorities. And I'm a great believer in that, because it's a much healthier relationship than always asking somebody else and saying, well, it couldn't happen because they wouldn't. I'd say to the government, what are you prepared to invest overall? Give us our fair share in Leeds and in West Yorkshire, and then we'll determine what the priorities are.
We'll decide
And
how
put
to
those
spend it.
three, I think, put those three things together. Now, for air quality zones, it's a huge issue in the centre of the city. The council, as you know, was working on a scheme before the pandemic hit us. And I am in favour of that, because it's going to go hand in hand with the move from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. And I think other opportunities for mobility, because in the end, people want mobility when they require it. And there are streets in cities around the country where a lot of cars spend most of the time parked up on the side of the road, because people commute to work, if they're doing that using public transport, but they have the vehicle for when they want to go visit their relatives, go shopping, go on holiday, go to B&Q, whatever it is. And if we have greater confidence that we can get the mobility than we need it, then I think we can envisage a different future in which there is less, there are fewer vehicles on the road, but we preserve the mobility that we have come to enjoy and value because of the freedom and the opportunity that it gives us, including in the way we live our lives, to drop the kids off at school and then get to work. And lots of people, have to work that all into their daily lives.
Absolutely. Well, we published a transport strategy 3 or 4 years ago, and our starting point was the freedom to go, the freedom for people to go. But then that freedom is tempered by all sorts of things, climate change, the practicalities of actually getting a bus, or where you can park the car, or where the trains are going, or how often they run, or whether there are night buses, or all these things. But the principle should be, I want to go from A to B. That should be my right to do so. But then there are certain things that may have to temper that, and that should be the approach that was taken. I was very pleased to hear that you're in favour of bringing buses back under public control, because that's something the Civic Trust supports. And it was interesting that the three areas of three priorities that you mentioned, if given a blank, not a blank check, but a large check, were housing, transports, and skills, because of course those are the three areas that fall within the remit of the new elected mayor. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit. We're coming towards the end now, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the opportunities that a Metro mayor brings to West Yorkshire and to Leeds in particular, and maybe not so much focusing on the areas where money is being devolved or powers are being devolved, but this idea that a mayor can be an influence, can bang heads together, can bring people together. I mean, I'm not suggesting that Tracy Brabin needs anyone's particular advice, but if she asked you for your advice in that general sense of what the mayor's role is and should be, what would you say?
I would say you're in a great position because you've got a huge mandate, you represent a lot of people, and you've been given a very loud voice, which is louder than us as individual members of parliament. So use it for the benefit of the citizens that together we represent. And I think we've seen, when we look at Andy Burnham in Manchester, or the mayor who's just been re-elected, Andy Street, in Birmingham. We look at the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, or Ben Houchin. All of them have used the position that they've got. They have formal powers and ability to do things, but they also have great capacity to influence and to argue for a case, for a cause, for funding, for a change in policy. And I think it's a really encouraging feature of the way in which politics has been developing, because we've obviously seen devolution to Scotland and to Wales and to Northern Ireland, but England has largely remained a very centralized country, and I don't think that makes sense. And I look, during the debate about what form devolution was going to take in Yorkshire, I think I probably supported all of the different options at all of the different stages, depending on what people could manage to agree on, because we needed to get something going.
Yes.
And we've ended up with the West Yorkshire mayoralty, and I'm sure that's exactly what Tracy is going to do. So it's a huge opportunity for us, and we should take it, and we should support her as she speaks for us.
Well, we're going to try and we're going to see if Tracy will do one of these conversations later on in the year. I think
that would be great.
A really good opportunity. And her priority, the bus service, bringing that back into public hands, being a priority of hers as well, is also something that we're pleased about. The Trust is actually launching a project next week, which is called Imagine an Excellent Bus Service for Leeds. And it's asking people, what would you like to see in a bus service? Yes, ownership is part of it, but how do you experience the service? What's it like when you go inside the bus? What's the, is it clean? Is it, what would make you use the bus more frequently, particularly as we come out of COVID, where bus patronage has gone down? So that's something we're going to be doing.
I look forward to seeing the results of that. Yeah.
Well, we're quite excited because we think there's a lot of interest in the bus, and there needs to be a lot of interest in the bus service, because even if we get a mass transit system, it will take time to implement, and in the meantime, the bus service has to improve. Hilary, a couple of final things before we finish. Just sort of moving on to the other area of interest for the Trust, which is heritage. We've been reviewing our blue plaque scheme. The scheme of 180 blue plaques now across the city, celebrating famous people, places, and events that have marked the development of the history of Leeds. I mean, we decided to review the plaque scheme in the light of the Black Lives Matters movement and other events that happened last year that caused us to question, what we represent in blue plaque form, who we represent, and maybe how we need to change the approach that we take. I mean, what's your perspective on this whole issue around representing the past, whether it's in sculptural form or plaque form or the written histories and people's particular interpretations? How do you think this, because it has become quite a divisive issue, it seems to me.
Yes, it has. And we can't change the past, but we can change the future. And I personally, I don't think, with perhaps one or two exceptions, there really is any point going around saying, let's knock that statue over there. There was a moment when there appeared to be a group of people who thought that Sir Robert Peel's statue on Woodhouse Moor should be toppled. I did my best to point out, I mean, he was originally in favour of slavery, but he came to the view that it couldn't continue and he voted for its abolition. So give people a bit of credit for when they eventually do the right thing. So I think that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is that I think that the Leeds Civic Trust Blue Plaque scheme, and I'm not just saying it because I happen to be on this call with you, it's because I believe it from the bottom of my heart, is absolutely fantastic. It really is, because when you think of what you've done recently, when you put the plaque up to Albert Johansson at Ellen Road, the first black footballer to play in an FA Cup final. I didn't know anything about Ivy Benson until I walked past the house that has her plaque on it and looked at that when you kindly invited me to the unveiling of the plaque to William Gascoigne in Town Street. Again, I didn't know about him, but he was, an astonishing pioneer of astronomy in the 17th century. Yeah. And I think as people walk around the city centre, and if they stop and gaze at the plaques, they learn something, they are informed, they're educated. And I think it's one of the most exciting things about the city. So all power to your elbow. And the last one I was gazing at was the one we unveiled not that long ago outside the Holbeck yes. Working Men's Club, commemorating the oldest club in the country. Because I think understanding where we come from is really important to a sense of place and identity. And I didn't know at the time I was elected as the MP for Leeds Central, which may seem a bit strange, but there we are, that my great-great-great-grandfather was born in Hunslet in 1799, and his parents were married at the old Leeds Parish Church, whose bells I hear at night, 3 years earlier in 1796. And courtesy of the wonderful West Yorkshire Archives, I have a copy of their wedding register entry and his baptism register entry. And just speaking personally, that gives me a sense of place. And the story of the Benns then went to Manchester, to Northampton, to East London, and I returned as the Member of Parliament 21 years ago. I think it's so important, and keep it going, which I know you will.
We will. But hopefully the stories that we tell, we'll strive to be as representative as we possibly can be of the breadth of the history of the city. And I think that's the key for us. That's really what we want to achieve in the next 30 years. The scheme's been running for 30 years near enough, and the next 30 years hopefully will be even better. Hilary, we've been going now for nearly 45 minutes.
Oh gosh! Well, I've been having a whale of a time,
which is fine. I mean, you know, but I think this is probably a good time to bring things to a close. That someone did actually pose a question on the chat there about how an inspector can decide on something that happens in the city. You know, how an inspector can effectively, you know, stop something. And I think that's just the system that we have, isn't it? I mean, it is.
And planning is very complex. And people sometimes say to me, why can someone appeal against not being granted planning permission when we can't appeal against the granting of planning permission? And it's all to do with property rights. Historically, that's the reason. But we need to reflect on these experiences and make changes. And if it requires legislation, that's something that me and other MPs have to push for. The other thing I just wanted to say when I'm thanking you is for the work you do, keeping a close eye on our heritage, in particular buildings that are at risk, which you and I have talked about many, many times. And it's wonderful to see some of those coming back to life. The last year and a bit, every time I walk past the first Whitecloth Hall, I peer, I take a photograph, and Rushbomb put a picture up today. They've put the original wooden roof beams back inside, which looks fantastic. I can't wait to get inside and see that. And I had a good inspect of the outside of Temple Works recently, and there's a wonderful imaginative plan to bring that back into use, hopefully with the British Library. And that was astonishing architecture and also engineering. Just the most amazing building. But I wondered whether you'd ask me, am I going to pick one?
Well, I was going to ask you.
All right, you were going to ask that favourite building. One. Well, I hate to be pushed into a corner, but I think I would have to say the Corn Exchange. Because, and I'm delighted to see the plans that the council has just unveiled to improve the public realm, as I think you call it, immediately outside, with some trees being planted. But when you go inside and you look at, it's particularly that glass roof, because it's not quite symmetrical, but it's utterly magnificent.
Yeah.
From top to bottom. And I hope that the space, the lower bit of space, can be brought back into effective use, because I think we've missed that. But it is one of the many, many jewels in the crown of the wonderful city that is Leeds.
Hilary, I don't think we can say we can finish on a better note than that.
Okay.
So I think we will call it today. So my thanks go to Hilary Benn for talking to us this afternoon. And just to say that we have a number of these events coming up, but one that might be of particular interest to people who've joined us this afternoon is one on the 11th of June at 11 a.m, where I'll be talking to James Lewis, the leader of Leeds City Council. So if you want to hear his perspective on some of the issues that we've discussed this afternoon, then please do join us for that event. But Hilary, it was a pleasure talking to you. Hope to see you soon in the flesh
yes.
After all these Zoom conversations that we're all having at the moment. But do have a good afternoon, and to everyone listening in today, I hope you found that interesting, and we'll see you all soon. So thank you very much.
All the best. Cheers.
Bye-bye.